1. d4 initiates a central pawn battle, immediately staking a claim for control of the key e5 and d5 squares, and opening lines for the queen and kingside bishop, setting the stage for a wide variety of strategic and tactical developments depending on black's response. This immediate pawn challenge on d5 directly contests the center, establishing a symmetrical pawn structure and preparing to develop pieces to control key central squares, often leading to classical queen's pawn game openings. This move initiates the queen's gambit, a classical opening that immediately challenges black's central pawn and seeks to gain a spatial advantage by controlling the center. This move by black adopts the Slav defense, a solid system that supports the central pawn on d5 with the c6 pawn, preparing to develop the queenside bishop and often leading to resilient pawn structures. This move develops a piece towards the center and prepares for kingside castling, maintaining flexibility in white's pawn structure and anticipating black's potential Slav defense setup. This move, developing the knight to f6, is a central tenet of the Slav defense, preparing to challenge white's central pawn structure and maintain flexibility in piece development. This move solidifies the center and prepares to develop the bishop to f4 or g5, aiming for a solid Slav defense structure while maintaining flexibility. This move solidifies the pawn center and prepares to develop the king's bishop, adopting a solid semi-Slav defense structure. This move develops the knight to a natural square, supporting the central pawn advance and preparing to castle kingside while avoiding any premature commitment on the kingside by the queen's knight. This move develops a knight to its natural square, reinforcing the d5 pawn and preparing to potentially support a c5 break or to develop the king's bishop. This move develops the bishop to an active square, preparing to castle kingside and potentially support a future e4 pawn push. This move develops the bishop to a natural square, preparing to castle kingside and maintain a solid pawn structure while contesting the center. This move solidifies white's king safety and prepares to connect the rooks, a crucial step in developing the queenside pieces and initiating play in the center or on the kingside. Developing the knight to its natural square secures the king and prepares to connect the rooks, a standard defensive maneuver in the queen's gambit declined. This central pawn push boldly stakes a claim in the center, aiming to gain space and potentially open lines for attacking play. This capture resolves the central tension, opening lines for piece development and offering black a chance to develop actively. This move centralizes the knight, challenging black's central pawn structure and opening lines for white's pieces, a key theme in the queen's gambit declined structure. This move relinquishes the central pawn majority, aiming to simplify the position and avoid the potential pressure white's pawn on e4 could exert in the center. This recaptures the pawn on e4, reinforcing the center and preparing to activate the queen and rook for kingside pressure. The knight returns to f6 to defend the e4 pawn and to prepare for the potential advance of white's e-pawn, maintaining a solid central presence. This retreat of the bishop from the active d3 square to c2 is a common maneuver in this queen's gambit declined variation, aiming to protect the kingside after black's knight retreat to f6 and to prepare for potential pawn pushes on the kingside later. This move initiates a common plan in queen's pawn structures where black aims to develop the queenside minority, often intending to challenge white's central control or create play on the queenside with the b-pawn. This move prepares to transfer the queen to the kingside, supporting a potential kingside attack and offering an exchange of bishops on c2. This move creates a safe haven for the king and prevents immediate tactics on the g5 square. But it also slightly weakens the kingside pawn structure. This move prepares to fianchetto the light-squared bishop to b2, where it will exert pressure along the long diagonal and support the central pawns. The move prepares to connect the rooks and potentially shift the queen to a more active square, supporting pawn breaks or attacking opportunities. Developing the bishop to the open diagonal improves its scope and prepares for potential central pawn advances or king-side attacks. This move prepares to contest the open d-file, a common strategic goal in Queen's Gambit declined structures, and allows the rook to become more active. This move brings the rook to the d-file, contesting it and preparing to activate the piece alongside the queen and bishop, aiming to exert pressure on black's central pawns and potentially target weak squares. This move develops the bishop to a more active diagonal, preparing to contest the open d-file and potentially support a pawn push in the center. This move prepares to reinforce the e4 pawn and potentially create attacking chances along the e-file by connecting the rooks. This move connects the rooks, preparing to contest the open c-file and bring the queen's rook into play for future operations. This move initiates a potential kingside attack, aiming to exploit the weakened dark squares around black's king and possibly create threats against g6 or h7. The bishop retreats to b8 to defend the c-pawn and prepare for potential future maneuvers, possibly along the b7-2 diagonal or to support a queenside advance. This move initiates a pawn storm on the kingside, aiming to open lines against black's castled king by advancing the g-pawn and potentially supporting further attacks with the f-pawn. The king's maneuver to f8 is a prudent defensive step, safeguarding the monarch from potential diagonal attacks via the light squares and allowing for a more flexible rook placement on the d-file. This move centralizes the queen, preparing to potentially exploit the e4 pawn after white's recent pawn break and aiming to support advances on the kingside. This move is a quiet repositioning aiming to escape the knight's pressure on the g-file, though it may also be a touch passive, allowing white to potentially build pressure on the kingside with future pawn advances. This move prepares to exploit the potential weakness on the f-file and potentially target black's king if it remains on g8. This move repositions the queen to a more central square, coordinating with the knight on f6 and preparing to potentially support a pawn break or defend the kingside. This move is a speculative knight sacrifice aimed at disrupting black's pawn structure and potentially exposing the king, but it overlooks the tactical defense available to black that consolidates the position. After the aggressive knight sacrifice, black must retreat the king to safety, as the central squares are now dangerously open and white's pieces are well positioned to exploit this weakness. This pawn push opens lines for white's pieces and challenges black's pawn structure in the center, potentially leading to an attack on the king. This move opens the c-file for black's rook and challenges white's central pawn majority, aiming to untangle its pieces and activate the queenside. This sacrifice eliminates black's crucial light-squared bishop, weakening the king's defense and opening lines for white's attack. This move opens the g-file for your rook, creating significant attacking chances against white's castled king, but it also creates a serious weakness on the dark squares around your king. This capture sacrifices the queen for immediate tactical pressure, aiming to exploit black's weakened kingside pawn structure and open lines for attack after the exchange sacrifice. The black king is exposed on e8, creating immediate tactical threats for white due to the open g-file and the queen's pressure along the diagonal. This forcing sacrifice leverages the open king's file and the pinned knight to create a decisive attack, aiming to break through the black king's defenses. This capture is forced by white's mating attack, sacrificing material to open lines to black's exposed king. This move delivers a decisive check, exploiting the exposed black king and creating immediate threats of mate after the recapture, forcing significant material or positional concessions from black. White has achieved a devastating attack by sacrificing the knight and queen on h6 and f6, forcing the black king into the open and creating strong mating threats on the light squares. This move continues white's aggressive king hunt, exploiting the open lines created by the pawn sacrifice and aiming to force black's king into a mating net or a highly compromised position.